So rather than speaking about governance in the exclusive instance of Prime, I thought it would be good to ground ourselves in a framework and to really understand the context of what governance means. Who is doing governance? How do we quantify governance? This is a very important question. And answering these questions, it's really going to expose to us what good governance should mean in the context of a DAO. So the name of this presentation is It Takes a Control Network, and that's what we're going to be exploring. We're going to be exploring control networks, institutional control networks in the old corporate world. We're going to be applying the lessons learned from these things to Prime. First, we have to ask ourselves the question of, what makes DAOs special? We have to think of DAOs as programmable organizations, just like cryptocurrency is programmable money. And that is pretty cool because that opens up, a very, very wide design space that we didn't have access to before. It allows us to structure these organizations in ways that we haven't necessarily done in the past. If you think of an LLC or a corporation or a national government, all of these organizations have very particular structures. Now, with this in mind, turning towards governance, the structure of an organization has a given trust model, and we're going to dive into that next slide. But externally, so internally we have this trust model for governance, and then externally we have this programmable capacity to dissolve and merge. So DAOs can interact with each other in ways that other organizations couldn't in the past. Traditionally, when organizations dissolved or merged, they hired a team of lawyers to get it done, and we're kind of entering the realm of doing this algorithmically or doing this in an automated way. So diving into the idea of trust models can be used to explain governance. If we think of a multi-sig wallet, we can think, okay, this is a few of n trust model. In most cases, that's going to be slightly above a majority. So if we have 3 persons governing a multi-sig wallet, we want 2 of the 3 to be able to pass a proposal or take an action. Prime fits into the 1 of n category. It uses a governance structure called holographic consensus. This presentation, holographic consensus, describing it is probably outside the scope of this presentation, but just for a very, very quick overview, it involves staking on proposals. So there is some skin in the game for those proposals that are submitted. And if a proposal fails, typically what happens is the person loses their stake. So there is kind of a spam filter with holographic consensus, and this allows us to utilize a 1 of n trust system. That means that if you have a proposal, you submit it, and you're the only one who upvotes it, that proposal can pass. It has the 1 actor who is aiming to pass it. And this type of system works as long as there is 1 actor in the system doing what they're supposed to be doing. So if we have 1 person or 1 group submitting proposals and saying, hey, I'm going to contribute value to the DAO, and these proposals are passed, then the system is successful. And this was kind of an interesting invention by Matan Field. He was the founder of DAOstack because he was dealing with the question of scalability. How do we have governance systems that are scalable? And the 1 of n trust model is a particularly scalable form of governance. Now, zipping on to another topic, I want to talk about ownership and control. So ownership is a quantitative measurement of the amount of decision-making authority you have in a given organization. So if I have 25% of the reputation of an organization, or 25% of the tokens, if it uses some form of token voting, then my ownership is 25%. Pretty simple to understand. Now, control is very, very similar, but when we're dealing with a network, so when we're dealing with 2 or more persons that are involved in an organization in that they both possess ownership, we can conceive of what's called a controlled network. So these two persons are, vying for the decision making with these respective quantitative measurements of their decision making authority, and this can be expanded. You can have hundreds of people, thousands of people, any amount of persons or organizations with different levels of ownership who, when taken in combination, populate a given control network. Now, when we think about the concept of ownership, there are a couple of dominant patterns that we witness in the real world. The first is that of a subsidiary. And if we apply that concept to that of a DAO, that would mean that a given parent's DAO has more than 50% of the decision-making authority over a sub-DAO. So that sub-DAO is kind of an extension of the parent. There is another type called a dominant stake. It's a noteworthy, but it's not a majority form of ownership. So, we're thinking here anything less than 50%, but we're not talking about ownership dust necessarily. Now, these two former items, they sort of represent organizations that are external to another organization. So we have a parent, we have a sub-DAO. These are two different nodes in a given control network. But when we're talking about internal budgeting, we have a branch or a department. It's not uncommon for transnational corporations to go into a country and set up a branch under the same legal form as the country that they have their headquarters in. And the difference here is that a branch needs to seek approval from its parents to conduct business. A subsidiary doesn't necessarily need to do this. When a subsidiary is set up, it has an independent treasury and it can manage its own budget, even if the parent is not participating in governance. So here we see an ownership network or control network in our language with two corporate boundaries. So really this is just a means of showing how different firms and individuals and even states can have different degrees of ownership in each other. And this ownership can sometimes form cycles as well. So you might have some indirect form of ownership. Think of it this way: if you have ownership in a company and that company has ownership in another company, then you have an indirect form of ownership in that latter company, in that grand son company, or however you want to call it, a sub-DAO, perhaps. And so things can start to get really, really complicated when we zoom out and we populate a control network with all of these potential relations. This is the Toyota Group control network. Toyota is fascinating as a control network because Toyota has 7 parent companies. It has 7 companies kind of sitting at the very highest level, exercising ownership over this massive network of subsidiaries and subsidiaries below the subsidiaries and joint ventures between all of the parents. So in terms of these joint ventures, those are sort of demonstrated in blue in this particular control network, and outright subsidiaries are demonstrated in green. And this is just absolutely a complex and really living thing. This is, in my opinion, more of an organism than an organization when we conceive of it. Now, in comparison to Toyota, there's no comparable crypto-native control network in blockchain today. We don't have the same network of ownership relations that we see in the traditional world, and I think that's bad. I think that is bad for the future of blockchain. I think that having a given topology, a given control network topology, so a given structure of relations, ownership relations, can make the cryptosphere resistant. It can make it resistant to instrumentalization or takeover by powerful foreign interests, and those interests are colliding with us today. We are seeing regulators get irate about the cryptosphere. We are seeing a number of institutions, treating this as if it's not an industry, and that can harm us, and we need to think of ways to be more defensive. Now, the other thing is that if we look at the core of legacy institutions, we can really understand that having a given topology is defensible because this core, its members, these financial institutions typically distribute their ownership to other financial institutions in the same core of institutions. Or we can say organizations. If you're not familiar with the lingo, institution is perhaps a more generalized way of referring to an organization. So the institutions that we deal with today, the huge banking conglomerates that we typically think of when we think of the quote unquote corporations or the evil corporations of capitalism, they all own each other. They are all playing the same game. And they are all very, very defensible as an industry because they all own each other. Here is an example. All of these organizations have ownership in each other. And when we talk about ownership cycles and the way that these cycles form, you can see that a lot of that ownership actually returns to the source. So in this particular graphic, we can see a couple of key cycles. AXA owns a part of Commerce Bank, who owns a part of Credit Suisse, who owns a part of Deutsche Bank, who owns a part of Barclays, who owns a part of AXA. So AXA actually has a cyclic ownership of itself. And this is where defensibility comes from, in my opinion. Now, this is a kind of a slice of what's called the large connected component. I'm not going to dive into the LCC, but it is a fascinating sort of nucleus of global ownership relations today. Actually, let's just talk about the LCC just a little bit more. When we take the top 20 highest owning corporations in the world today, so we look at their ownership relations and all the subsidiaries that emerge from them, they own about 27%, or they control about 27% of the world's liquidity. So that is a financial measurement. It's not an ownership measurement. So there are 20 organizations today that control 27% of all of the assets that exist. I find that problematic, and I think you should too. Now, kind of switching gears and looking at this from a crypto native perspective, what is an example control network that we can conceive of for DAOs? And I want to focus on Uniswap for a second. So the Uniswap treasury today, or the Uniswap DAO as they call it, is worth about 1.4 billion. That number has been really volatile lately. I think I picked that number about 6 weeks ago, so I have no idea what it's worth today. And they recently spun out a $3 million a year Uniswap grants program. And this resembles the formation of a new subsidiary. This grants program is receiving funding from the parent still. It's not, self-sustainable quite yet, but this is how subsidiaries are created. You put some money in as a deposit or as shareholding capital, and you see how this thing grows. And many times they fail, and that's that. Now, I think it's a bit absurd, to be honest, that Uniswap is only funding this with $3 million worth of Uni tokens, but it is what it is. When you're sitting on 1.4 billion, I would expect a much more generous amount of investment flowing. But if you're smart, you should understand intuitively that this is not actually the control network that Uniswap DAO has. Uniswap DAO's control network consists of a number of venture funds that own Uni tokens, and they are the ones who ultimately govern the Uniswap DAO. So in my opinion, the Uniswap DAO actually sits as an instrumentalized node of a stronger control network of financial institutions. A16, USV, these sort of who's who of crypto investors, crypto venture capitalists, who actually do, if we did a full mapping of this space, I would suspect they are the ones who sit at the core of all of these different DAOs and crypto networks. But to Uniswap's credit, only 18% of its tokens, which are governing tokens, so 80% of its ownership, sits with these centralized financial entities, these VC, if you will. Now, there is something else I want to highlight here, in that not every institution is looking necessarily to instrumentalize or take over the blockchain space. A lot of institutions are actually looking to cooperate with the blockchain space. They see it as a means of exit from reliance on a financial system that can't necessarily be trusted anymore, with this gigantic printing of dollars and this crash in money velocity in the global financial system. And we can see here the topmost Bitcoin treasuries being held by legacy institutions today. And one thing a research friend of mine pointed out is that because Bitcoin does not have a proper ownership structure, Bitcoin is actually completely resistant to instrumentalization. By purchasing Bitcoin, MicroStrategy does not have control of a Bitcoin treasury and cannot determine how Bitcoin is distributed. So, extrapolating from everything we've already discussed, we can imagine two possible futures. In the first possible future, DAO ownership becomes subsumed and instrumentalized by centralized financial institutions and VC. DAOs kind of become these speculatory investment vehicles. Profits are measured in dollars or euros or whatever the fiat of the day is. And the large connected components simply eats the crypto institutional yum. I'm not looking forward to this future. I think we're on this path, and I would like to see that change. The second future is that DAOs endogenously structure, so endogenous means from within, a self-sovereign crypto institutional control network of their own, generally aiming for separation or mitigation from centralized financial institutions. And we have to pursue a topology that makes us resilient to this kind of behavior. We have to pursue a topology that allows us to structure some sort of crypto institutional commons, which is separate or mitigated or mitigates this massive distribution of ownership to centralized financial institutions. And the truth is, like all things, our future is going to lie somewhere in between. But my bias is towards the second future. Now, let's assume, though, we want this future. The question immediately becomes, how do we achieve it? And I would like to reframe this question. I think the question should be much more tactical. We should ask ourselves, how do we distribute ownership effectively across organizations in a given control network? And once we start thinking in this direction, we can start to directly apply this way of thinking to DAOs like PrimeDAO. Now, following this logic, we need the right tools. Now, what do DAOs crave? And this is a good question to answer, because I think this is PrimeDAO's secret sauce. I think if PrimeDAO can build some of these things, PrimeDAO will have left its mark on crypto history, as you will. We need descriptive maps of our neighborhood. We need to know who owns what, and what that person is doing with their ownership. We need to know which of our neighbors, so which folks are kind of on the edges of our control network, are useful to engage. And we also need to know which ones are potentially hostile. We need to be able to negotiate with these folks. So we need interfaces and protocols that help us accelerate this process of mergers and acquisitions and trade. And we have another presentation later on DAO to DAO interactions, and that's exactly what's going to be discussed there. I want to note that Curve Labs is pioneering research in this particular direction, and we want to be part of the solution when it comes to this. We need computational social choice algorithms like quadratic funding, conviction voting, and pairwise preferencing. Budget Box by Colony is an example of pairwise preferencing to intelligently distribute large sums of capital. And if tokens represent ownership, then distributing that capital means we are distributing ownership through well-defined neighborhoods. So we need to be able to draw a line. We need to say, these folks in our neighborhood are going to contribute to us. We know because of this feedback infrastructure that we have, and we are now going to distribute ownership in such a way that it will make resilient our own existence. We need more specific ways to define ownership rights. I think the idea of having ownership over a treasury and a protocol as tokens have been structured today, is not necessarily useful. We need more specific ways of targeting ownership, and things can sort of look like cash flow rights, as they are in the corporate world, or we can look at data income rights. So if people are pulling data together, they maybe don't necessarily own the data pod. The data pod could be perhaps its own investment vehicle, but they could own perhaps some sort of monetized data income from this data pod. And then finally, we need effective signaling and feedback interfaces. Basically, what this means is we need to know what people are thinking. We need to, and we need to know in such a way that goes beyond polling. Polling is a very, old-fashioned way of getting to understand what the crowd thinks about. There are very sophisticated ways of doing this. The nation of Taiwan uses a software called Polis, that's POL.is. And they use this to distribute innovation funding in Taiwan based off of civilian participation. And I think that's just wonderful. This here is difficult to read, but it is an example of flow of a DAO to DAO negotiation. This could be applied to any given governance structure. So if any given trust model that an entity is using for governance, this is just a way of showing how two organizations can interact, or how two DAOs can interact. And Curve Labs, like I said before, is building this tooling. Now, returning to the ownership distribution problem, I believe I have an answer here. I believe I have a solution to how we distribute ownership effectively. I believe smart DAOs should recruit a collection of interacting squads to grow themselves. Today's DAOs are particularly non-interactive. Individual token holders of low ownership share all orbit a highly capitalized treasury. This is what Uniswap DAO looks like. You have all of these uni holders, none of them are participating in governance, and there's no interactions between them. Now, this is an example of what I'm discussing here. Now simply just apply these types of network structures to our control networks, and we can see that as we move to the right, we create a more and more resilient topology. When we have a network of teams, which we can think of as a network of squads, we co-collaboratively end up creating an institution which is very, very difficult to instrumentalize or take over. And just to give you an example, imagine a particularly irate bus hits a member of the core components on the left-hand side, so this core group of nodes. We have just wiped out that person's relationship to all of these other nodes. Now, if we take this concept further and we look at primes today, I think it resembles something like the second image in this chart, or the hub and spoke with subteams. Now, I think if we are to develop Prime in a smart way, we want to move from this second category to the fourth category. We want to move to a functioning network of teams that is tightly integrated. So people are not only functioning within a team, but they are holding roles outside their team. They're interacting with co-owners in this sort of prosumer collective, or prosumer financial collective, and they are helping this thing grow through their interactions. So squads matter. And they matter for three reasons that I want to highlight. These reasons are borrowed from the disciplines of permaculture and cybernetics, respectively. And I think it's worth researching either of these two fields if you haven't been exposed before. So resilience to emerge in complex systems, like a complex control network, variation needs to be attenuated by variation. This is a very fancy way of saying, as we are exposed to new challenges, we need to have a network of different people who are working to solve these challenges, and then sharing those solutions with the rest of the network. And if we do this effectively, we can have a very liquid information ecology within the network. We can have solutions aggregated into a collective memory, and we won't have to deal with problems as a new problem all the time in kind of an overwhelming way. Squads with multiple DAO tokens have multiple liquidity sources, increasing their chances at survival and preserving the collective memory. When folks have multiple overlapping forms of ownership, they stop viewing problems in isolation. And again, this goes back to the first point. If we're going to solve things, we should do it collectively. We should aggregate our solutions. This is a shortcut to understanding the world. You know, if you want to learn how to cook as a child, you don't go into a kitchen, you know, hurling knives around and hoping something gets cut. You go ask your mother or father or whoever your parent or guardian is, and you say, "How do I cook?" And they'll teach you. The other thing to consider is that these co-ownership structures mitigate the harmful effects of crypto tribalism, which is such a problem in our space. You know, you have folks who simply don't agree with each other based on which coin they own. And the answer is, if they owned all the coins, they wouldn't care. Think about that. My final point is the individual shareholder is driven by greed. You know, they want to make money, they want to make profit. This is, you know, why people invest in this space. But networks are driven by growth. So if we want our DAOs to succeed, if we want our crypto networks to succeed, they need to be able to grow and grow effectively. And there's a tension introduced by these competing motives, by greed and by growth. And I believe that squads that have multiple you know, forms of DAO tokens can navigate and mediate this tension effectively. So they do pursue squad wealth for each other, but the work that they are contributing to a given DAO or a given crypto network, you know, is helping it grow. It's helping it maintain itself, become resilient. So, you know, all of this should be straightforward enough that we could ask ourselves a question that has a very, very, you know, obvious answer. You know, which governable crypto network or DAO do you think will succeed in the long term? One that is majority owned by squads, you know, basically, or one that is majority owned by token holders and venture capitalists. And to me, answer one makes the most sense. If we have all of these different builder groups who are organized by their interests, by their various objectives and sub-objectives, have formed different niches in the industry, whether that niche is at the very, very back end, solving very complex problems with state machines, or at the very, very top social layer, being good community builders and helping people become more aware of what's going on in the DAO. If we can connect all of these groups effectively, and they all have an ownership stake in this entity, I think it will survive in the long term in a very effective way. Now, this is contrary to the way this industry has traditionally functioned, and it introduces a tension in that if we give more ownership rights to builder squads, there's less ownership for speculators. So there's less ownership for these venture capitalists and these token holders. And we do need to think about this. I'm not trying to say that this type of speculation is bad. I actually think it's very good. I think it's very healthy to have a fixed investment to help you overcome growth challenges. You know, money fixes problems. We need to keep that in mind. And we should also look to the other side as well, where, you know, people who are doing a fair launch and are unwilling to take any investment at all, we need to consider that these folks might not have the right idea, that maybe it's okay for them to sell 20–25% of their network's ownership so that they can grow. There's a healthy medium here, and that's what I'm trying to put out there. Now, the reason I have this 25% number in mind is because I'm simply taking the ownership distribution from the topology of the large connected components, this extremely resilient, extremely powerful nucleus of financial institutions that exist today, and I'm working backwards from it. So kind of the opposite or the inverse ownership distribution of something like this is to, you know, have all of these prosumer squads who are co-owners. You know, this is an example of a silo's ownership distribution over time, or its allocation table for its native token, which is a governance token. And pardon me, I'm going to take a sip of water here. And we can see, you know, the way that they budgeted and the way that they have spending, the way that they can spend their reserve. You know, they're spending 26% on economic security. That's amazing. Ethereum spends close to 100% on its economic security, and it absolutely doesn't need to. it's underinvesting in its other in its ecosystem, in my opinion, and in Vitalik's opinion too. Vitalik just wrote a great blog post that was published today, where he laments this overspending in economic security. But it has close to 61% of CELO is spent on builders. It's able to be spent on ecosystem. It's able to be spent on squads, and I think that's very, very good. And only 13% is being diverted to the speculator class of token holders and VCs. And you know, we are looking at this from the perspective of the year 2060, so it's not distributed like this today. This is going to be the way it's distributed over time, but maybe that's okay. You know, maybe it's okay to have a higher percentage ownership by a given group of VC and speculators in the beginning, and then over time for that higher distribution to go down as more and more groups get involved. So there are some cool projects thinking this direction, and I want to highlight one of them by Decent Partners. Decent is going to a number of different chains. They're going to Edgeware, they're going to Decred, they're going to Algorand, and they're trying to fund what they're calling a meta-DAO, so a DAO of DAOs. And this meta-DAO has the mandate of funding public goods, so funding something like the DAO-to-DAO tooling that I've been discussing. And this is good because that means that, you know, when DAO-to-DAO tooling gets funded, it is not going to be behind some sort of you know, unnecessary friction like a usage token. It's not going to have some sort of ownership as a product. You know, it is going to be able to you know, live and breathe on its own as open source software. And the DAO-to-DAO tooling will benefit the 3 networks that funded the Decent DAO. So there is synergy all around in this type of polycentric ownership formation. There are other projects thinking along this way. You know, Colony has the Meta Colony, and they're trying to approach it in this way. The Commons Stack, again, they have this trusted seed, and they're looking to go out and use this trusted seed to create an ecosystem of effective commons. But anyway, I want you to take away one thing from this presentation. I want you to take away the idea that topology is ideology. The way the world is structured today, the way the world's control network is in particular structured, this is an ideological statement. This is a statement of, you know, we are okay with a form of neoliberal capitalism where institutions, financial institutions in particular, can own or control 20 to 20, I think it was 20% of the global assets that exist. And that's only 20 organizations, by the way. I think that's preposterous. I think we can pursue a topology which is more equitable and is serving to all of us, you know, working together to create new subjectivities, to create spaces where new ideas can emerge and new ideas can flourish. And these ideas should be distinctly open source ideas, in my opinion. So if we want the second future to come true, we need a control network that reflects its values. And I think PrimeDAO is on the way to having a very, very well-distributed control network. I think that other DAOs, as they launch, should definitely get involved with PrimeDAO. Perhaps we should have an alliance of DAOs working in cohorts, similarly to the 8 cooperating parents corporations in the Toyota group. And I think this can all be accomplished, and I think it can be accomplished.